Early access for a lot of gamers can be a mixed bag. Some of the best survival games going, including Valheim, DayZ, Ark, Conan Exiles and Rust, all started out in early access. And sure, some of the titles have had problems over the years, but you can't deny their popularity. Millions upon millions of gamers have tried these games. But what about the rest? What about the early access games that hadn't had updates in years? Well, Steam is finally doing something about it and labelling correctly on early access titles when they last got an update. I honestly think this is amazing, definitely out there. Players won't realise sometimes that a game just isn't getting developed enough because they don't necessarily go checking through the Steam news forums to see when the last update hit. For sure, there's always going to be some legitimate reasons why a game doesn't get developed, and some games just require a lot more time, but they will deliver with content. So I'll be discussing that today a little bit as well, and the games that really need to just improve on communication versus games that are absolutely abandonware. Got a big focus though on Snail Games, the founders and owners of the Ark Survival franchise, as well as another rogue developer who loves to just put out asset flip after asset flip. My name's Jade, taking an in-depth look today at the world of survival. Let's go. Okay, so we're going to be kicking off with something called Frozen Flame, but I want to point out that I'm not trying to hate on developers. I know how hard it can be to get a game made, and sometimes games just aren't successful, but something clear needs to happen. Devs need to communicate everything that's going on. So Frozen Flame was a action RPG fantasy survival game with full base building and very much elements of Fortnite mixed in with Monster Hunter. It was promising dungeons, proper co-op play and the ability to customise and make your bases while gathering resources, fighting fantastical creatures and taking on massive bosses. It came out in winter 2022, so 2.5 years ago, and has only really received a couple of major updates, the last one being over 20 months ago. And this is why I'm putting it at number 10, because this might be a good example of a game that might actually get finished one day. Steam doesn't take into account if games are doing anything on a separate branch. It's pretty common in a lot of early access titles to have test branches or beta branches where they put in new content and then they merge it with the main. But this was announced last year and they still haven't seemingly got any new info about when it's going to be merged. This new update that's supposedly going to be the road to 1.0 put into the main game. It's still got a all-time review score of mixed at 65% positive, but most recent reviews are painting it as mostly negative due to maybe this lack of communication, and that's pretty crucial. Some games do take forever to get updates out. Valheim is one of the best games I've ever played, but their major content drops, biomes and bosses and more have each taken over a year to produce. It's just celebrated 4 years in early access, by looks of things it will be complete by next year. But again, the difference is about communication, and they have also updated with smaller updates in between. It's perfectly okay for a game to take a long time to get finished and done, as long as they are telling players exactly what's going on and what kind of updates to expect, and maybe chucking in a few small ones at least to let players know the game hasn't been abandoned. But yep, according to their news blog, a lot of this stuff should be in their open alpha they've got currently playing right now, but you do have to choose the right branch for it. New bosses, new portals, new creatures and more, but another big warning, they have just reduced the price of their game last year, and it's never a good sign when a game has to do that. It really shows they may be overcharged in the first place, and that might be why some of these games really fail. Valheim was massively popular because it was really super cheap too. There's definitely some early access games I would pay more money for, including Valheim, because it felt finished almost with the amount of polish it had, with the less bugs and issues that most of these types of games have. But ultimately, this game just maybe didn't attract enough attention, especially on a more mature platform like PC, where I think this would be better on an Xbox or PlayStation. Is that going to happen? Probably not, but let's hope they do manage to pull this out of the bag at some point this year. Zelter was a 2D pixel art top-down game promising urban exploration as you fight off waves of zombies, trying to get enough components to build up your defences and hopefully survive another day. Looking at the gameplay now, and bearing in mind this came out in 2020, it does remind me a lot of Vampire Survivors, but a little bit more, I would say, crafting and open world stuff. It generated a fair amount of buzz, but they had significant issues almost straight away. Problems with some of their dev team, not getting any kind of updates out, going a year almost without talking to players properly, And when they did come back, it was to announce a new game to go and test multiplayer functionality to be added or revamped into Zelter. But what you need to know is it hasn't had an update in 2 years, and whatever they're doing with this new game, testing out stuff, it looks like it'll end up being another separate game on its own, and supposedly working on both games at the same time. That's never a good sign. Plenty of game companies have secret projects on the go or other games running alongside one of their main. You've always got to be ready for the next thing, and it takes a lot of prep. But to go a year without any content updates or news and then announce another new game but then still say you're still working on both, nah, that's not it. No game has a God-given right to sell lots of copies and be successful. It has to provide something new, fresh, or just really interesting for players to get behind. When it can't do that and ultimately it fails, they'll end up shutting the studio down. That's what happened to Fractured Veil, a successful little mini Kickstarter, something they were hyping and building on for years, and it basically ended up being a flop. It was meant to be kind of Dead Island, but more open world crafting and survival, all set in the tropical paradise of Hawaii. And yeah, it just didn't actually reach a good enough audience. They shut the studio down, but instead of leaving the game up to maybe make a few $100s once a month, the devs removed it from Steam. And this is what I wish so many of these games that we're seeing in this list would just do. Would just let people know this game isn't getting any more content instead of just leaving it up as abandonware. Jaws of Extinction technically doesn't have the warning, but its last content update was in May 2023. They then announced in May 2024 exactly what's been going on with legal issues and a lot more, and that they would have a open alpha testing Unreal Engine 5 upgrades if you join their Discord. So come on Steam, get these guys, put them on a naughty list. Maybe it's only games that reach a certain amount of copies sold that Steam will even be bothered with, as this one didn't sell that many, and you could tell from a mile off why. It just didn't really offer anything new or exciting. The graphics were dated for sure when it launched, but that's not to say that all Unreal Engine 4 games look bad. But its timing was pretty off, coming out in the same year that the Unreal Engine 5 was making waves with Ark 2, Nightingale on the horizon and a lot more. This game was meant to be an open world crafting survival apocalyptic game where you'd meet NPC traders, join up with your buddies in up to 4-player co-op and try and find a cure for a world ravaged by pretty much the Last of Us disease. It's not that original and didn't look great, and they had substantial issues even before they launched the game. Another Kickstarter project, they promised backers a playable version of it, so they released that back in 2019. They then stupidly used the same depository and game page to release their main game, so for all intents and purposes it looks like this game's been out since 2019, but I give them their dues, it didn't come out until 2021. Not into early access officially anyway. And the first year and a half, 18 months was relatively good, even though the game had negative reviews. They seem to be updating it regularly and giving communication a good go, if somewhat a bit brash in certain comments on social media, Discord and the Steam forums. But then yeah, legal issues happened at some point in 2023, they went silent for nearly a whole year, and now you can go ahead and play the updated engine version, but only if you join Discord. It's another huge red flag. A game developer just can't even use proper beta branches, can go silent for a year and then just expect things to be okay? Nah, avoid this one. Now obviously some of these games you would never probably touch anyway because they're just not your style, even if they are survival. And it's hard to care about a game not getting an update if you've never heard of it in the past. So really all these examples are just to show how things can go wrong for a game really, and the pitfalls of buying early access for sure. But I am glad that Steam is doing something about some of these vapeware games that have just been abandoned. Desert Skies was a survival crafting game set in the Wild West with a colourful art style. Came out in 2019 but hasn't had an update in over 3 years. Again, there could be understanding with this one. It's seemingly developed by like one person or extremely very tiny team. For all we know, the dev might have dropped dead, been hit by a bus or maybe stepped on a rattlesnake. Despite its kind of low review count, it did seem like it had a bit of a future. People generally were happy with it, even though it's now got a mixed score, which is a lot better than other cowboy style Wild West survival games I've seen. But yeah, the dev just went completely AWOL, hasn't updated, hasn't given any kind of notice on any social platforms stating what happened, just literally disappeared. Before The Last of Us took the crown as the biggest gaming in open world / maybe survival, there was Dead Matter. One of them big huge games that raised over $1 million on Kickstarter with dreams to be the next DayZ, in fact proclaiming itself as the ultimate DayZ killer. Made by a very new team out of Canada, Dead Matter was hype beyond hype, and for years we've been told and shown in various different dev blogs how much progress was going and being made. Kickstarter backers finally got their keys, and lots of closed betas and stuff were happening, with some creators getting access to give feedback. After many delays, like literally it was meant to have come out in 2019 and then delayed and delayed again, it finally released in 2023 and met with a huge wave of criticism. Basics of the game, like not having a great netcode, especially in a multiplayer open world survival zombie apocalypse title, is probably not the best thing. It just wasn't what was being promised or shown off in so many dev blogs. Accusations that they'd waste their money, with various different YouTubers going over the controversy and exposing them for wasting apparently a ton of money. They panicked and started banning critical posts in Discord and a lot more, and weren't really receptive to the fact that their game was just kind of shit. Not for a while at least anyway. A good few months after its launch, they finally started communicating properly and started saying that it was going to be having some brand new updates to fix the game and hopefully get it into the state players expected. They're not yet on the naughty list for Steam, apparently having a minor hotfix back in March of 2024, but it won't be long before they get added, I'm sure. You could maybe take it as positive that they did announce a couple times during summer last year that they were going to be streaming on Twitch showing development. But June of last year was the last time they actually put anything on their Steam page telling players that they were actually back with more content. Their foundation update that they did release in March of last year just really still wasn't that amazing, even if it was trying to address so many of the basic stuff that people were critical of. So perhaps trying to do a No Man's Sky, but really still failing massively because they just can't seem to talk to people. Their excuse is that they don't want to be hyping up the game or promoting it while it's in a bad state, and they're finally starting to recognise it is. But that is clearly just a misdirection. The game is just struggling because they just didn't have the experience. A lot of the same dev team has gone on to work on a new one called Vein, leaving the curator and a few other members that may be struggling, but still no excuse. A game that was hyped so much, that made so much money, should have done a lot better. So it goes without saying, avoid this one. And on to my favourite part of this video, talking about Snail Games, the publishers and owners of the Ark Survival franchise. Wildcards are the team that made this and gave everyone in the survival space something really unique and different, if buggy and maybe undercooked at various points. I hate on Ark at any opportunity I can now, but it made me a YouTuber, it gave me my start, and it's the pretty much window to so many people's love of survival games after maybe just DayZ or Rust. And of course Minecraft. Ark was huge, it continues to be huge, even with the game being, again, remastered now but still in early access somehow, paid to win mechanics, added even more microtransactions, more DLC, and just becoming an absolute cash cow. And that has mainly been down to Snail Games, their overlords. So no, Ark definitely is getting updates for sure. The original left early access back in 2017, and of course the Ascended remaster might eventually get finished by 27 by the time they add all the remaining DLC and more. But it's the other Snail Game properties that we're really talking about. They are actually the publishers and owners behind Last Oasis, a title that's now been 2 years without an update. This one was really egregious because the devs pretty much abandoned their next season content and drops for this, even though they'd sold over 1 million copies, to then go and work on Bellwright. This came out last year and actually is doing okay with good reviews mostly, but this game absolutely reuses a ton of different animations, a ton of assets from Last Oasis, and it just rankles with me that yes, you can have success with another game, but you go and leave your other one to die for 20 months. Bellwright's more of a focus on PvE and simulation settlement building with your friends rather than maybe the PvP direct nature of Last Oasis. Like, there's nothing wrong in moving on to another game. As I said earlier, you can work on 2 games at once. But you've got to keep the original up to date somewhat. You've got to let players in the loop about what's happening, and these conniving developers went totally ghostly silent and basically tried to just pretend that Last Oasis didn't exist. Last Oasis was really fresh, although it still had its own issues after nearly being sued by an artist who was basically responsible for the actions of the walker legs. The devs wholesale more or less ripped it off and had to acknowledge it eventually before being taken to court. And I'm sure they ended up paying a little bit of money to the artist. And Last Oasis had its problems. It launched into early access with negative reviews because even though they had tests and were doing all the right things, they just really weren't scaling up correctly for the huge amount of people that would be joining, and basically the netcode was garbage. I really like this game. I got behind it as much as possible. Previews, news and guides when it launched, and I felt like it could have a potential, a good future, but the devs tried to put too much in terms of PvE content, which was sorely lacking, and then still managed to fuck things up by not really sticking by their PvP fans still. In the battle for water across various different regions, you would travel with your walkers, so you could have huge clans come and steamroll different areas, and some of the areas would actually disappear over time, being burned up as part of the story's lore, giving players a fresh chance to try life on a new server with their walkers / bases. And then after hyping up that their next season was coming with lots of movie improvements and changes, they just went pretty much silent and dark. They managed to launch the game on Xbox where it's rotting in game preview, and it took about 9 to 10 months before finally announcing that they were going to have a modder take over development of Last Oasis. Going from having maybe 20 to 30 developers working on it to now only a team of 2 to 5, while the rest carried on work on bellwright. Now, credit where credit's due to this modder that's become a dev. He seems to be doing his best. They've had some beta tests again where you can take part in different ways, and it looks like this summer we could see an update for a game. But it definitely took them far too long to really just be truthful with fans, saying that the success of Last Oasis wasn't enough and they still needed to bring some revenue in, so they'd have to start working on another game alongside trying to keep Last Oasis alive. But they didn't do that. They went like a year without any kind of actual communication. And despite all this talk about getting this season up and running, like I said, it still hasn't been updated yet. Despite all, Last Oasis has now moved into mostly positive territory, the most recent review. So that gives me some encouragement that this modder knows what he's doing at least, and it's just his actual bosses that haven't got a fucking clue about how to run a game company, or they are under the thumb again of Snail Games, who absolutely don't have any issues in abandoning games or keeping fans silent while they go and waste a bunch of money they made from Ark originally. So yeah, I'm still on the fence whether or not this will end up being good. I still think it's unforgivable for a game developer or a publisher to go silent for so long and then just start working on another game, abandoning the first one. But technically, they have now breathed life back into their first game, Last Oasis, so fingers crossed it gets more updates and maybe returns to something somewhat of a success. Last Oasis reportedly did sell 1 million copies. Atlas sold over 2 million copies, and even though it was a huge flop when it launched due to simply just not testing actual functionality, whether or not it could support thousands upon thousands of players joining at once, again published by Snail Games, but this one is a bit different. It's actually made by the same people directly that made Ark. Studio Wildcard split their studio into two, making Grapeshot Games to maybe take the heat away just in case Atlas didn't work out, and that's exactly what's happened. While they gained more staff and recruited for both positions eventually, they would get behind Grapeshot in a big way, and the actual founders of Ark, Jeremy Stieglitz and Jesse Rapsack, were definitely a hand big time in creating this game. It originally started out as a mod for Ark and then transitioned into a full release. But yeah, it showed off a whole ton of issues, players disconnecting, rubber banding, and just not working correctly because they just didn't believe in testing like so many of the other games, including Ark, over the years. I was one of the first tubers to leak this game's existence after they accidentally left their first trailer up on YouTube. And I was really hyped. It definitely got the imagination running. Imagine Sea of Thieves, but in a more realistic graphic setting with all the mechanics of Ark that players loved. But it became the meme-worthy game of the year when creators got actually a chance to play it after queuing for nearly 2 or 3 days in some instances. Yeah, the graphics weren't great, the mechanics were awful, and the connectivity was just not right. It quickly gained a mostly negative review score. Yet Ark fans still persisted in buying this game, and I'm guessing that's what kept it going, because they did get updates for the first 2 years. They even managed another Xbox port, but almost immediately after getting it launching on the console, they started messing around with the content drops. At one point going over 6 months without any meaningful big updates, with only a slew of tiny little hotfixes, promises of new content coming, but huge issues behind the scenes, multiple creative directors leaving. They're taking away half their team that were working on a DLC for Ark Extinction to work on this game, and then they did the same, taking the team off of Atlas to go and work on another DLC for Ark Genesis 1. Meaning Atlas has had various different windows where it just didn't have fully working development on it. Again, it looks like they've got involved using modders of the game to go ahead and start working on it properly, but it hasn't had an update now in 2 years. No news in all that time either, nothing talking about any plans, what's gone on, what's gone wrong. Even when I directly asked the founder of Ark during a live stream, he said no comment. So despite its rocky flop launch, it did manage to start gaining some fans, and people still excited for that Xbox launch. It sold literally a few million copies. It must have done by the amount of reviews it's got. And I could accept that maybe they just needed to take a break, re-envision what Atlas would be, because that was kind of what they were aiming for with their last season. If they could just keep people in the loop about what's going on, but they haven't. They've just literally gone ghostly silent. And even worse, the game is now starting to not actually work properly. And that's a big feature that are maybe not addressed enough. A lot of these games can or maybe just about run, but there are so many issues and problems with these games that get abandoned. And Atlas is no different. The single player has been bought for a huge amount of time. And then literally with no announcement at all, they stopped having official servers last year. So the only way that you can play Atlas is by spinning up your own servers, joining a network of unofficial ones, or trying to persevere in single player even though it crashes and wipes your data regularly. It's been mentioned once during Snail's financials as costing them 11 million, and it looks like it is a write-off. But wait, there's a lot more to come from Snail. That's not even the oldest scam they've got running. Dark and Light came out in 2017 and it effectively was a fantasy rip-off of Ark. It even had the same code as Ark for certain creatures and items that you could spawn in. It was very clear from some of the animation work and stuff that was going on that they totally reused a bunch of assets. Not a crime in itself, but certainly when a game stops getting any kind of content, it does paint a big picture of just quick cash grabbing. That's what Snail is about. Again, another one that seemingly might have sold a good couple million copies. It's got over 10,000 reviews and is now mostly negative. Steam can't even keep track of exactly how many years, just resorting to saying it hasn't had an update in over 5. It's actually more close to 7 years without any kind of new content. Their last official interaction with the game was back in 2020 when they adjusted some of the server rates so you could get more resources. And that year they did do a bunch of different events and again more server boosts and increases. A few little minor hotfixes in 2019 and one patch that did have significant notes, but again all to do with balancing. So yeah, it's pretty much been 7 years since it actually had a decent chunk of new content added to the game. And yep, 5 years now since any interaction at all or any kind of news about what's going on. And this is when I really started to take a dim view of Snail Games and started to realise they were all just about trying to replicate Ark's success by pushing out game concept after game concept, hopefully trying to catch fire, and then as soon as they don't make it millions straight away, they abandon them. Or try to port them over and rinse some more money, like the Dark and Light mobile version that came out in April 2024. So they had time to port an unfinished early access title they've not updated in 5 years, no fresh new content in nearly 7, but can't get any kind of developer to work on the game still. Snail reportedly gave a chance to 2 fledgling developers to develop Dark and Light and then did nothing but hound them and ask them to make it more like Ark. To the point the developers ended up having to quit because they just couldn't take any more oversight from Snail Games interfering and desperately trying to make it another Ark success. Thing was, the game was selling okay. It still had a roughly decent player count considering if they'd actually invested more money and supported developers originally, they might have still had another fantastical success like Ark. But wait, there's one more. In fact, there's a whole bunch more. They ended up setting up a separate division called Wandering Wizard, supposedly in charge of finding indie games, especially maybe on the US side, given that Snail are very heavily based in China. Through Wandering Wizard, they have released a bunch of smaller independent little games. Some have been successful, some haven't, some are early access, and some definitely have been rotting. Outlaws of the Old West, yep, another Ark kind of ripoff, but this time in the American Midwest, having your horses, shooting cowboys, you get the idea. You are getting the picture now. This is another one. Came out, actually sold enough copies to maybe carry on progress, like literally 5,000 reviews, means it sold at least 50,000 copies, but then swiftly abandoned not even 6 to 9 months later, hasn't had an update in 4 years. I could actually go on listing even more games from either Wandering Wizard or Snail that really have not done as good as they should, but you get the idea. Avoid anything they have their hand in. This is why it's so important that you, a player, make sure you're looking into the games that you're buying and who they're published by, and creators also make sure that they've got a responsibility to check on these things and not hype up games that are made by serial abandonware developers. And my last one that I'm finishing off with, a whole collection of games really that are just asset flips, and you need to stay away from this game developer as much as possible. He's got ties to art because that's where he started off as a modder, but kind of got outcasted after having so many different arguments in the modding scene. He's a developer that has now published around 15 different games or have some in development. His name's TBJBU2. And he's a serial asset flipper, utilising so much stuff from the Unreal Engine to create scenes that at first look great, like this Grand Emprise reveal, some shit like that. Got really hyped by a bunch of creators and influencers when they first saw this trailer. It looked like a massive mix match mess to me of Unreal assets just being thrown together and being called a game. Now technically this guy doesn't release a lot of his games in early access, but he does release a bunch of them and never updates them, going so far as giving maybe a couple hotfixes before moving on to the next one. And they're just rip-offs, like the Chocolate Factory that was trying to literally just rip off Satisfactory. The reviews for the majority of these games are bad or mixed at best. He somehow weaseled his way into other great games and being able to sell maybe, big bundle versions with them, helping to prop up the idea that he's actually a good developer. From Ark biotic robot clones to again more crafting stuff, this guy needs to be avoided. But I did want to highlight him. I've been meaning to for a while. I keep getting emails to check out some of the games because I've had interactions with him in the long distant past where I did try calling him out a few times on just being a bit of a dickhead. So back to the start. It's great that Steam are finally introducing more warnings to tell people whether or not a game is actually getting still worked on. But it's still got a lot to do before it really is giving players and consumers more warnings about abandonware, asset flips and a lot more. These are the kinds of things that Steam isn't necessarily catching. Let me know what's the game you're most sad about if you've played any of these in the list today. Is there other games not maybe in the survival genre that you really hope or wish they would get more updates? Or simply put, what games should you stay away from? Always here with honest opinion, I'm Jade. I'll see you at RATBAGGERS for more in-depth news videos like this in the future.